Hi, I'm Mike Mulligan, and I'm a whistleblower and a safety advocate. I've worked at Vermont Yankee for 13 years. I was a submariner on a nuclear fast attack. So yesterday I was looking in the NRC document thing on the internet, and a LaSalle document came up, a LaSalle nuclear plant. It's a pretty, let's see, LaSalle's in Illinois, and it's a pretty big 2-unit plant. It's cooled by a big cooling pond. And so they're, let's see, how big are these guys? They're pretty big. 1138 and 1150 megawatts. They're BWR5. So I was, so that document was LaSalle asked for a license amendment request. They wanted to increase their lake cooling limits, their safety limits, their temperature. They have I think it's 101.25 or something like that degrees, and if they go over that, it's unsafe. It's unsafe for their like their diesel generators and their emergency core cooling systems. So and it was a response to the NRC was responding to the license request, and the NRC was kind of fiddling around, and they didn't like their evidently LaSalle wanted to have Dura limits or whatever. In other words, they wanted to have a sliding scale limits depending upon what time of day it was. It was ridiculous. I think it's the first in the nation they were ever going to have. If it was like 9 a.m. and a bad accident happened, they would have like a 101 degree limit on their. If it was noon time, it would have 103 degree, or or if it happened at 6 p.m., it would have a 103 degree limit. If their cooling pond got to be 103, it would be they would have to shut down. So it kind of sounded kind of ridiculous. And then the NRC was complaining about they had a transport time of like 30 hours. In other words, the hot water comes out of the plant, I don't know, 120, can be 140 degrees, comes out of the water, and it goes into the lake, and the lake circulation goes way around, and it's a circulation rate of once every 30 hours. And so that there's a delay time. When that hot water enters, they got 30 hours before the inlet sees it and stuff. So they were debating what's the worst case. And then LaSalle came up with the worst 2-week period, because they wanted to do an evaluation on the worst 2-week period. The weather period, the climate period, the worst as far as like daylight and temperatures and humidity, and what is the worst historical record, what is the worst period, and based on that worst period, are they safe or not? And of course I come back and say, well, you're looking at the rearview mirror. You should be making an evaluation what the future is going to hold to us. There's a rate of change that's been going on the last decade. The rate of change of, say, the lake temperatures have been climbing, I don't know, 0.2 degrees every year or something like that. And so then you should, if that's the rate it has been for the last decade, or 0.1, then then at the end of the licensing period, you would make an evaluation based on the amount of local heat rate rising type of thing. So I'm kind of thinking of them things in there, and I said, did LaSalle have a bad year last year? Were they threatened by their lake high temperatures? And I didn't remember. So I know that Braidwood had troubles for a few times, and then they were in the paper about what's this mean? You know, Braidwood lake temperatures have increased, and they had to ask the NRC permission to stay up at power because they exceeded their licensing limit and they weren't safe. And what does that mean to the nation as a whole? And of course, last year was the year of the Midwestern drought, and it was pretty bad, and most of the streams and lakes and Mississippi River were all had low stream flows. You know, they're breaking records from the past the 1950s into the 1940s and stuff like that. So everybody's worried about, you know, how the stream flows and lake temperatures will respond in the future. Well, we were worried about, you know, how bad it was. And then Exelon had a lot of trouble with their nuke plant staying up at power last year. There had a lot of low flows and high temperatures, and a lot of they were forced to reduce power rates and stuff. And we know that Millstone was forced to shut down because their Long Island Sound temperatures were too high and they were unsafe, and so they were forced. One of their units was forced to shut down. So, you know, that's kind of going in my head. You know, I'm kind of thinking of these things. You know, Millstone, LaSalle, Braidwood, and so I said, "Boy, this is strange that this stuff with LaSalle." And so I did a lookup on the internet about LaSalle, and I get a let's see here. I get a dang computer. Come on. I get a event report for August 39th, 2010. You know, get a event report. Well, first I said, well, what did LaSalle, what did Braidwood nuclear plant and Millstone teach me last year? And it taught me that as far as LER wise, and if you get an LER, you're lucky if you get an LER in these things. They are very the lens through which the procedures they use, you know, is very narrow. You only get to see, you know, like Millstone. They were talking about Millstone. You know, they were talking about the means of measuring the temperatures, and they were going to go take it away from the control room recording and instrumentation, and they were going to have people running around the plant taking local measurements and averaging it, and that would give them you know, a 0.3 degree leeway for some reason or other, and stuff like that. And so and then you ask, well, why, you know, what is the history on that? And according to the rules, the NRC's rules and the utilities rules, they can completely not discuss the historical record behind this. You know, is this an event that comes out of nowhere, or is this an event that's been building for the last decade, and everybody knows that it was there, and it was coming, and they're just crying wolf now when an event shuts down a plant, or when it threatens to shut down a plant. You know, it's an emergency. It's not our fault. We couldn't see what was going on, and this has come out of nowhere. And please give us a reduction in safety margin types of stuff. So that's what these guys can do. They can make believe it's an emergency out of nowhere. You know, because the rules allow that these guys not to talk about the historical context and stuff. That's what I learned out of Millstone. You know, it's they didn't talk about the rate of change of their surface water temperatures in the last decades, and you know, they've had warning after warning of challenges to the high temperature limits and stuff like that. Anybody with any brains would know that it was just a matter of time and stuff. And so to get back, and so the LaSalle, and then they're talking about, you know, on 8/12/2010, LaSalle Unit 1 and 2 commenced a plant shutdown at 1952. LaSalle ultimate heat exchanger exceeded 101.5 limit per technical specifications, and the required action, both units 1 or 2 are to be in a mode 2 hot shutdown in 12 hours and cold shutdown within 36, I think it is. Unit 1 was initially at 76% power due to a something or other and stuff, and then we get another one that comes up and it says at 8/13/2010 it was discovered that a fish kill took place in LaSalle County Nuclear Station cooling lake due to increased temperatures. Approximately 2,000 fish, primarily gizzard, shad, but including bass and walleye, were found by plant workers. As summer temperatures increased, the cooling water temperature increased above 93 degrees, the threshold temperatures which the species are susceptible to increased water temperature. So they had a fish kill, right? And so then I'm, that's kind of interesting. And I'm looking at that, and then I say to myself, it's if they had a fish kill because they had increasing lake temperatures due to weather conditions, a hot summer and stuff like that. That was 2010, right? And stuff. And so then I'm saying to myself, well, that's kind of strange, it's kind of strange. And then I do some more searching, and I find an inspection report of this October, and well, actually, I found an inspection report a few months after this, and it talked a little bit more of what happened. And they they came down in power because their essential service water traveling screens filled up with dead fish. I mean, that's why they came down in power, really. Their traveling screens filled up with water and filled up with dead fish and their bones and body pieces and whatever and stuff like that. And it threatened, it was reducing flow to a lot of their essential and non-essential, well, mostly their non-essential cooling water, and they were panicking, and they came down in power. And stuff, and so then it's a little more. Now, see, now you find out a little bit more. This thing is really the first enunciation of it is really simple and incomplete, and the second one gives you a little bit more information, right? And it tells you that actually plant cooling was threatened by these dead fish, these dead fishes. And so then I looked a little bit more into this thing, and I found one recently this October, in October it found, the NRC looked at this problem again, right, in 2012, this October, it was 2012 October, and stuff, and they looked at this problem again, and I'm saying to myself, and they said that they, basically, LaSalle didn't do an evaluation over the worst case condition. They didn't consider, well, what happens if a worse event than the 2010 temperature rise in the lake happened and more fish died, and would it lead to a plant losing their non-essential and essential cooling water and stuff like that. And so, and that's what I'm thinking. I'm starting to think, what would be the worst thing? They're wanting to do they want to do a amendment. They want to increase essentially increase the temperature limits of the lake and stuff like that. And is that going to drive them into a bad accident and stuff like that? So I was thinking about that when I first seen this. And I was thinking about, okay, like the worst accident would be they have a a series of hot days, and they get up near their limits, right? They get up near their limits. There may be 102, 103 degrees, a limit they've never seen before, and then they have a massive fish die-off, right? And just as the die-off of fish had reached the intake of the plant, they had their bad accident, right? And stuff. And then the next thing you know, they would kick into losing their non-essential and their essential cooling water flows, because they're both from the same cooling canal. They both go down the same cooling canal and stuff. And so could you lose all cooling? Could you end up losing your diesel generators at the site? And the diesel generators are cooled by the lake also and stuff. And so then the next thing you know, you could be in their worst. You could have a loss of coolant accident, you know, like they're talking about, and you find yourself in a station blackout, and you could end up with a core meltdown pretty quickly, you know, because you didn't have because the fish clogged up the cooling flow to the diesel generators essentially, and the RHR and your Lipsy flow to the core. You could stop all that coolant flow. So says, well, this could be a pretty bad accident, and certainly they didn't take consideration. They didn't take consideration when of the fish kill. In the licensing amendment, this new licensing amendment, trying to raise the lake temperatures and stuff like that, and I says, this critique in October weren't talking about the fish kill in there, and it seemed like it should have been talking about that, could you have these new increased limits, and could you have a fish kill that comes out and clogs up all of the cooling flow to a nuclear plant? And it seemed like they should be talking about that, because that would emanate out of this licensing amendment temperature increase, right? So I'm saying that it's kind of getting crazy now. There's a lot of crazy thinking going on here. And this Dural, whatever it is, sliding scale, heat sink temperature limits and stuff like that. It's just like I talked about you in the past, how these guys, increase complexity. Hundreds of thousands of pieces of equipment and hundreds of thousands of rules and stuff like that. Really complex, and their only solution out of this deal is not to decrease complexity, but to increase it. Now they're going to have the operators having to, they're going to have to keep an eye on the worst climate conditions. In other words, if they're going to decide 2 weeks back in 2009 was the worst climate the plant has ever had, and so in the future they're going to have an eye on the worst 14 days. And they're going to have to keep a track of the last 14 days, and if it gets worse than the 2009 14 days, then they're out of the licensing boundaries and stuff, and so then it negates the amendment requirement and stuff. So it increases the complexity a whole lot and stuff, because they're going to have to keep a track of weather, and they're going to have to keep a track of the worst 14 days weather that they've had in the past, and they're not keeping a track of they're not creating excess capacity, because the climate in the area is going to increase anyways, right? They're not going to design the plant for that and stuff. So it's crazy. And so then I start saying to myself, wait a minute, LaSalle's they probably had a uprate in the past at some time, and then I started getting clues that they've had a series of licensing amendment requests for the ultimate lake temperatures. The I can't think of the name of it. The lake, the ultimate heat sink. You know, they've had like 4 or 5 of these amendment requests, temperature increases, or a rendition of trying to increase the amount of cooling that the lake can do, or at least paper whip the ultimate heat sink limits and stuff. That's all it was paper whipping. What's going on here? They're fiddling with calculations that nobody can see except them, and the NRC is right in there. And so there was, like I said before, there was no connection between this incident and the incident in 2010 with all the fish that died and stuff like that. They didn't put it into it wasn't required to put it in an LER. It should have been in an LER. It should have been fully documented in that LER and how it affected the plant and stuff. That, you know, if it wasn't required, they should have did a voluntary one, because you know, knowing that it was a pretty big deal. And so and it was, like I said, between the inspection report was limited, like it was blind. They were blind. The inspection report was blind to the new license amendment request. They weren't you know, holistically. There wasn't, you know, the recent fish kill inspection report of the 2010 event wasn't included in the discussion with the licensing, the new amendment request. So you know, it looked like one group was isolated from another group, and they weren't talking together, type of thing. And it more or less looked like it was a intention. This thing wasn't. These are smart people, and it was intention, type of thing and stuff. And I says, well, what is going on here? There's got to be something going on here bigger. So that's when I started. You know, I looked at all last year with LaSalle, and they really didn't have any problems. They had a few warnings, but they really didn't power down because of high lake temperatures last year during the bad drought. You know, 30, 40 miles away from them, the Braidwood plant certainly had a power down, and the Braidwood and the Byron plant, they had trouble with their cooling towers last year, and they were down quite a bit. And stuff. Remember I talked about Exelon this year canceled a lot of power upgrades, and they're slashing capital expenses to their nuke plants. And so then I said to myself that there's 4 or 5 licensing amendment requests to increase the heat temperature limits on LaSalle cooling lake, and all through the, you know, between 2000 and 2011. And you know, it's not like it's one time deal, it's 4 or 5 times. And then I'm saying, oh, where the hell did they have this uprate and stuff? And the uprate came at 2000, 1999, 2000. They got a 5% uprate. They were allowed to increase their power output, their electrical capacity, by 5%. So that was 5% at 2 plants, 10% going into the lake, going into this cooling lake in 2000, in and around 1999, 2000. So I'm saying, you know, the initial plant designers, you know, what the plant came online, was new in 1983 or something like that. And I'm saying, you know, when you consider, you know, they must have sat there and said, well, we're building 2 BWRs, and they have so much, they're going to be putting out so much power. And they must have did a calculation and said, you know, we need this kind of a lake. We need this kind of a lake to dissipate so many BTUs, you know, zillion BTUs in a year in the worst conditions and stuff. And amazingly, you look what the initial engineers did for the and for the size of the lake. They sized that lake really nice. If they wouldn't have done anything, that lake was enough to certainly compensate for any summertime temperatures in the early 80s. But also, as the temperature climbed, as our environment climbed, they seem to have taken into considerations a safety margin, a economic margin of excess capacity of that lake. And so that's, like I told you, it was 5% per plant. So they threw in 10% more capacity of heat into that lake. That's a lot of megawatts. That's a lot of heat during the summertime and stuff. And so, and if they wouldn't have done anything and just stayed at that pre-1999 power, I think they would have had enough excess cooling capacity margin in that lake where you wouldn't have had to worry about, exceeding any limits. It was perfectly sized. Those engineers, when they were building it, when they were designing that plant, and knowing that the capacity that those two plants were going to put out as far as heat, and then saying, "Oh, we got to make a lake this big because that's an engineered lake. It's a totally engineered lake. It's a man-made lake, and stuff." And so, once they threw in that, once they uprated that plant to, 10%, 5% both plants, then that skewed the calculation. And then forever after, they were starting to bang into, then a license amendment would come out, because of the summertime temperatures and the humidity and blah, 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 the lake, because of the rises in the temperatures, we got to do an amendment. They did that 4 or 5 times, and each time they did it, the next time they did it, they didn't say, "Oh, this is the second time we had a swipe at fudging the paperwork. This is churning the paperwork. This is the second swipe at churning, this is not the third time at churning the cooling lake heat capacity paperwork and stuff like that." So you see what I'm saying? Once they did that heat up, once they did that uprate, that's when they had the slew of, that's when they kept running into, every time they had a hot summer, they would run into the limits of, the safety limits of the lake temperatures, and they did that 4 or 5 times. And so, that is so unprofessional as far as, not knowing the heat capacity of the lake, and then you throwing in that power uprate, and they're going to do another. They're getting ready to do another 10% uprate in 2014 and 2015. It's probably been canceled because of the low electric prices on the grid and stuff like that. But it's been essentially a cover-up. This is a cover-up as far as why they were having all these licensing amendments for. Why were they banging up on the lake temperature limits every summer or every other summer, or 4 times in a decade? And why did they keep serially submitting licensing amendment to increase the temperature limits of the lake, and so that you were driving a plant in an unsafe condition and stuff like that. And so you never could get a list of all the. I had the power uprate in 1989. I had this licensing amendment in 2001. We had another one in 2003. We had another one in 2005, and we had another one in 2011, and they were all mysteriously, and you never could see in all these licensing amendments, you could never see a list. You never could see a historical record of what was going on and stuff. You would always see it through the lens of only the most recent event, and they never had a contextual. They never contextually gave you information about the history and stuff, and how incompetent you were. I'm going to write up a 2.206 on this guy, and I'm going to have all the dates and maybe when I write it up and all the information, I can talk a little bit more coherently than I did today. But so that's just what I'm talking about with the LaSalle plant. It's they shouldn't. The NRC was covering this up. If you knew, I think they were not being honest and falsifying paperwork. Both the NRC and the Exelon with this business. And you know, the funny thing about the whole thing is it looks like they're right at the limit of what their plant is designed at. You know, they're right at the limit what their what their main condenser is designed at, and that around that 101 degree, 101 degree, and stuff at 100 degrees lake temperature. You know, the vacuum is high, and they're normally forced to come down in power. They're worried about the vacuum being bad and stuff, and main condensers foul real easily. They become fouled more easily at the the higher temperatures. You run them at high temperatures for a long period of time, they foul real bad, and then you end up having bad main condenser pressure or vacuum, and then you're forced to shut down. So they're right up on the edge. That main condenser and its cooling system, its circuit water system, is right up on the edge of its capacity. And every time the temperature gets up to about 110, they end up having they're worrying about staying up at power. Anyways, I'm going to write this up, but this is just a little taste. Mike Mulligan here.